Hi, my name is Dave Rowland. I'm the Director of Litigation for the Freedom Center of Missouri. And if everything had gone the way that we expected over the last several months, I would have given this talk at the Constitution Party National Convention in St. Louis. But of course, things have not gone anything like anyone expected over the last few months. And so, as a result, I'm giving this talk on YouTube, and hopefully, you'll have the opportunity to see it on the Constitution Party website. I was asked to give this talk because I have devoted my life to the U.S. Constitution and making sure that, number one, Americans understand the constitutional system that we have been given, and also to make sure that the courts are enforcing the constitutional freedoms that we all should have. Um, I've been a lifelong follower of American politics, and I grew up with a very strong sense that all humans are imbued with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and most importantly, that every person deserves equal protection of the law. No person should have special favor or special disfavor in the eyes of the law. And that has been really sorely put to the test in the last few months. We, of course, have the COVID-19 pandemic that continues to run across the country. Then we had some really extraordinary government responses, and I don't mean that in a positive way, to the risks posed by the pandemic. And as a consequence of those responses, we are now also dealing with um, a very significant economic concern. We're looking at best at a recession and potentially even at a depression as a result of some of the policies that have been implemented. Um, and then on top of that, we had the extremely unfortunate situation with George Floyd in Minneapolis, where he, of course, lost his life, at least in part, due to the actions of a police officer who seemed to have a wanton disregard for his safety. Um, and flowing from that, of course, we have nationwide protests, some of which have involved property damage and looting, and harm to other people. Um, and all of that combines to make this an extremely unusual circumstance, and one that causes a great many people to question what direction is our country supposed to take. Um, this is a situation that cries out urgently for principled, thoughtful leadership. And unfortunately, that sort of principled, thoughtful leadership is not something that the two major parties in this country are prepared or equipped to provide. Um, the two major party duopoly has existed for so long that they are deeply entrenched in certain positions, and those positions may have little to nothing to do with what is actually best for the people of this country. And in particular, it has little, maybe nothing to do with what the Constitution requires and prohibits in terms of governmental responses to this sort of extraordinary situation. And so now more than ever, although it sometimes seems kind of trite to use that phrase, this nation needs leadership. It needs people who are willing to stand up and offer um, an uncompromising vision of what our nation should be. That's what leadership is. Leadership is offering a positive vision for what the future can be and inspiring people to get on board in helping to accomplish that vision. And unfortunately, we don't see much of that kind of leadership from the two major parties. Um, we desperately need to cultivate the sort of leaders who will bring our nation back to constitutional principles. So that's the basic gist of how I see the situation in the country. And as I was thinking about what I was going to say in this presentation, I was somewhat torn between, do I want to be practical, or do I want to be inspirational? And I think what I settled on is doing a little bit of both. I want to provide a very clear idea that we can, in fact, make a positive difference in the nation by talking about the Constitution and constitutional principles. We can inspire and we can lead the way that the country needs us to lead. Um, but I also wanted to provide some practical thoughts about how to make that happen. And so I'm going to try and weave both of those things together as we talk. I want to start speaking from a little bit of experience, my own experience. Part of the challenge that any third party has is getting a seat at the table. The way that our system is constructed, and I do mean constructed, many state constitutions are expressly designed to protect the two party system, to exclude third party candidates from getting that crucial seat at the table. Because ultimately, in order to succeed, any political party has to be able to get its message to the people. They have to be able to touch hearts and minds. And it's very difficult to do that if no one knows you exist, if you're not part of the conversation that gets reported in the news, that people hear in their day to day lives. And so I think step one for any party that is not part of the duopoly is we have to figure out, how do we get that toehold? How do we get that seat at the table? Um, Sometimes the barriers that we're dealing with are legal barriers. So, for example, in St. Louis County, their county charter was rigged so that for certain special elections, only representatives of the two largest, most popular parties even had a possibility of getting candidates on the ballot. Um, this was brought to my attention by members of the Constitution Party. And so several years ago, we filed a lawsuit that said, no, look, the number one thing that a government by the people requires is a legitimate choice between candidates, and that cannot be limited to just the top two parties and whoever survives their nomination process. Voters deserve a true choice. And fortunately, we were able to persuade the powers that be to eliminate the charter requirement that prohibited minor party candidates from the ballot. Now, the Constitution Party member who ended up on the ballot did not win their race, but it was very important that they at least have the opportunity to get that seat at the table. By participating in an election, even if you lose, you have the opportunity to get your ideas out there, to familiarize people with the party that you align with the principles for which you stand, and that opens the door to future successes politically. But you have to start by opening that door. You have to make sure that there's a reasonable possibility of getting on the ballot to begin with. The second challenge that we face is that even when it's theoretically possible to get candidates on the ballot, frequently the system is again rigged to make it easier for the two major parties to get their candidates on the ballot, while it is much more difficult for minor parties to get ballot access. And so there have been efforts over the years to try and loosen up some of these ballot access requirements. Sometimes they've been successful, other times they've been not. But I do think that that's something that we need to focus on. And I would like to say that my group, the Freedom Center of Missouri, and other groups like mine throughout the country are willing to be partners in that effort to try and get minor parties the same ease of access to the ballot that the larger parties enjoy. So that's something that needs to be looked at as part of the overall strategy for bringing the Constitution Party to the eyes of the public and making them, helping the public understand the benefits that the Constitution Party platform could bring and that particular candidates bring with them when it comes to potentially serving the public in an official capacity. Um, Beyond that, though, once we have dealt with the question of, well, is it even feasible to try and get candidates on the ballot? Then you've got the question of electability. And this is a significant challenge for any minor party because the major parties have very firmly established farm systems where, at the lowest levels of government, municipal office, sometimes in county committees, they have started to groom the people who will eventually become their candidates for higher office, talking about seats in the state legislature, statewide office, potentially even representation in Congress. And so the larger parties begin at that lowest level, and the potential candidates build experience, credibility, and a record that they can then tout when they ultimately run for a higher office. It's more difficult with minor parties because minor parties typically do not put their best candidates in these local races. They tend to focus by putting their best candidates in statewide or congressional races. And that makes sense to a certain extent because if you're going to have any opportunity to showcase your message, you do want to have kind of your torchbearers, your best candidates in the most prominent races. But that also has kind of the unintended consequence of eliminating the possibility that these really good candidates might be able to be successful if they set their sights just a little bit lower. And so that's something that I want to talk about, this idea that leadership begins locally. Even if you have a incredibly high quality candidate, somebody who has the skill set and the ability to persuade others, if they do not participate in a winnable race, then you're kind of squandering that talent. And so, what I want to encourage you who are listening to this message is consider aiming low first. Consider working to build up a Constitution Party farm team by aiming for a local office to start with. Now, I do have to acknowledge this is a long-term strategy. You know, we're not going to have a Constitution Party member winning the White House in the next couple of cycles if the very best Constitution Party candidates are going for local offices instead of higher offices. But again, I think that that's part of a trade-off. In order to eventually make a bigger splash at the national level, I think the Constitution Party needs candidates who have established a track record in office. And that necessarily, I think, begins with aiming for local offices. In particular, I want to point out that in almost every state at the lower levels of political service, there are nonpartisan races that you can participate in. And I think that that might be a very good place to start, because one of the things that that voters think of is they look at name recognition. Voters tend to become acclimated to voting for names that are familiar, which is a problem when the most familiar names are the names that belong to the two major parties. But it also provides an opportunity. If someone within the Constitution Party can establish that toehold in a local office, win a couple of cycles in a nonpartisan seat, voters will become familiar with that person. They will become accustomed to putting a check mark next to their name, so that when the time comes for them to aim for a higher office, a higher profile office, voters may already be predisposed to put the check mark next to that name, even if it's got a Constitution Party designation next to it instead of a Democrat or Republican designation. So that's something I would like people to consider as part of a long-term strategy to build up a Constitution Party farm team so that you can eventually have an actual established record to run on when time comes to run for those seats in the state house or the state senate, or maybe even running for statewide office. Because if we don't have that kind of a track record, that level of familiarity, the fact of the matter is it will be very difficult, not saying impossible, but very difficult to ultimately have success. The other thing that I want to say about leadership beginning locally is that in order to really raise your possibility, raise your potential for attaining office, the people in a jurisdiction have to be familiar with who you are as a candidate. And there are a number of different ways to do that. I'll just share some of my own experiences with starting the nonprofit that my wife and I run, the Freedom Center of Missouri, because we believed very strongly that we wanted to establish a presence in Missouri that let people know who we were so that when the time came, they would trust the messages that we would bring to them. They would understand these are people that are worth listening to. And our very first action when we came to DC, or when we came to Missouri from Washington, DC, was we reached out to African American communities in North St. Louis that were being threatened with eminent domain. Eminent domain, property rights, is an incredibly important issue for a lot of poor communities because they're the communities that get targeted for the loss of their property. They're the ones who have historically suffered the most from the abuses of governmental power. And we knew if we could go into those communities at the very outset and start showing them, number one, above all, that we care about their well-being, we knew that that would go a very long way towards establishing a presence that would pay off in the long run in terms of people trusting the perspective that we were bringing to the table. And so within a couple of months of coming to Missouri, I was going out to churches in North St. Louis and I was talking to them about eminent domain, about how it had been used historically, about the constitutional problems with the use of eminent domain, and most importantly about the value of property rights and how if we can persuade the government to respect property rights the way the Constitution mandates that they must, that would be a net benefit for these poorer communities, particularly African American communities. And to this date, we still have friends on Facebook who they may disagree with us on any number of policy issues, but they know that we care. They go to bat for us whenever there's any question about who we are morally and ethically, and where we stand, particularly in relationship to minority communities and poor communities. They still come out of the woodwork and go to bat for us when there's any question raised. And it goes back to the fact that we focused locally. We focused on building relationships, building mutual respect in those communities, and that is invaluable. So let me share a little bit with how that has been invaluable. Years after that first foray into North St. Louis to talk to the African American community there, I was approached by a handful of progressive African American Democrats who were on the fringe of their own party. And the powers that be within the Democratic Party were trying to marginalize them and prevent them from getting into the races that would challenge the established candidates. I'm sure everyone listening to this message is familiar with how this works. Whenever someone within the major parties, especially in the mainstream of the major parties, senses a threat from the outside, they use the legal mechanisms that are available to them to try and force that person out of the competition, basically deny them a seat at the table. And that's precisely what was happening with these candidates in St. Louis. They were being attacked legally by their opponents, and they were also being told that it was very possible that the mainstream candidates were going to employ voter fraud or election fraud to try and prevent them from winning their race. And so I went out and I worked with these candidates. We were able to eventually prove that these mainstream candidates, one of them had held office in the state legislature for 6 years. She was a three-term incumbent in North St. Louis. And we were able to show that the only reason that they had held on to their office was through election fraud. And we got the result of the election overturned. And when the people were given an opportunity to vote again, they ended up voting for these marginal candidates. Now, I've gotten questions over the years. How in the world could you represent a progressive Democrat? You know, the policies that they advocate are 180 degrees in many instances from what you yourself would prefer. And I fall back on a couple of principles. Number one, it is a deeply ingrained and absolutely fundamental constitutional principle that our elections need to be fair and legally handled. The people have to be allowed to vote for the candidate that they believe will best represent them, whether or not I agree that that would be the best candidate for that office, but also that we have to have confidence in the integrity of our election system. And we were able to ensure that confidence by going out and fighting on behalf of those candidates. So here's the other thing that went into that. By showing that we were willing to apply constitutional principles across the board, even when we were talking about candidates that I might not have a lot of policy agreement with, that added to the respectability, that added to the trust that people have in the ideas that I would bring to the table. And that's, again, absolutely crucial when it comes to folks who are interested in getting that seat at the table and eventually attaining higher office. You need to be able to have people trust that you are an honest broker of information, that when you say something, you're not saying it just because it might benefit your own political cause, but because it represents a deeper truth about the nation that we all live in and the way that our society should function, particularly when it comes to the Constitution and the way that the Constitution applies across the board. So on the heels of that success, we were able to engage in conversations at a level that otherwise we might not have been able to. We got that seat at the table that I believe is so crucial for a third party coming into this political process. We did that in part by working with people that we might not agree with on a lot of things, but we'd find an area of agreement, and then we would write an op-ed together. So, for example, former Missouri Supreme Court Mike Wolf, former Missouri Supreme Court Judge Mike Wolf, and former Solicitor General Jim Layton here in Missouri. I've butted heads with Jim Layton on any number of cases because his job was always to defend whatever the government was going to do, and my job was always to challenge the constitutionality of what the government was doing in many instances. So we disagreed on a lot of things, but we were able to find common ground on a couple of important issues. And with Judge Wolf, the three of us wrote a few op-eds that were then published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And very favorably received. That kind of collaboration um, demonstrates to the public that yours is a voice that's worthy of attention. And that is what political candidates need more than anything else. They need the kind of legitimacy that comes from that public recognition. Being able to have that seat at the table, to stand up next to people who are prominent figures in their own right and show, hey, look, my ideas are just as worthy of consideration as theirs are. Um, this is something that each of you can do in your own communities, in your own states. Um, Look for opportunities to reach out to people that you might disagree with on a number of things. Find a common issue and ask to work with them on it. Say, hey, I've been thinking about this an awful lot. I have something I'd like to say. I'd like us to be able to make a statement on it together. Would you be open to that? And if you can get that kind of a buy-in, if you can build that kind of an unconventional alliance, it raises your stature in addition to helping to amplify the positive message that you want to get out there. And there are any number of issues across the policy spectrum where we can find that common cause. People are frequently stunned to find that I partner with the ACLU of Missouri on a number of different issues. Now, there are a handful of issues that I will just disagree with the ACLU on all day long, but we also have a lot of areas where we agree. For example, free speech. The ACLU was very supportive of the cases that we litigated in favor of the Constitution Party, in favor of these candidates in that election fraud case in St. Louis. They've also been very supportive in cases that I've handled on behalf of some Republicans who were not in the mainstream of their party, and also libertarians. So when you find those unconventional alliances, it can be a very powerful mechanism to help you promote the ideas that are so important, but also to help get your own name out there and start building credibility as a voice worthy of consideration. Um, so I think that start by looking at your local situation and finding ways that you can speak out and be heard, such that people will start to recognize, all right, this is somebody that we need to consider seriously. Then, when the time comes to make that run for local office, whether it be a city council, board of aldermen, county commission, you could even theoretically aim a little bit lower if you wanted to. Just to get that foot in the door. Let me share another story real quickly. We dealt with one of our clients who initially tried to run for state representative. She was unsuccessful in her run for state representative, and instead she decided she was going to run for the school board. Lo and behold, she spent so much time working in the community to build familiarity with who she was, what she was about, that she ultimately did win a seat on her local school board, and now she's the vice president of the school board. And ultimately, I think that may well be a springboard for her into some higher office, whether it be the board of aldermen there in her city, or ultimately even potentially a seat in the state legislature. But again, it happened because she recognized she needed to start smaller. She needed to start locally. But when the next big opportunity comes around, she'll have 4 to 6 years under her belt of serving on the school board. People will recognize her. She's become a known commodity in the community, and that definitely raises the possibility of her winning an election in the future. So that's something that I would encourage each of you to consider. Number one, start off by recognizing the people in your community that need to be spoken to, that need to have the message of constitutional freedom brought to them, and then look for opportunities to work with others to help advance that message, even if it means dealing with folks that you might not agree with on a lot of other issues. Because let's face it, that's an important part of our political process. It is absolutely crucial that we be principled, that we stick to our guns as far as matters of constitutional principle. Um, but one of the things that plagues our nation right now is an inability for people to work with those with whom they disagree. And that's bad for the country. It's bad for our entire system to have that kind of a gridlock. We have to be able to at least talk to each other about the ideas that are going to shape our society. So, um, one of the other things that I wanted to put out there is the idea of being evangelists for liberty. This is something that Jennifer and I talk about when we are going out and doing Freedom Center events. Um, the sad fact of the matter is that a lot of people in our society right now do not really understand constitutional principles. They don't understand what our Constitution stands for, what it says, and they certainly don't understand its importance. They don't understand the reasons that we need checks on governmental power. We need limits to what the legislature can do. We need limits to what the executive branch can do. We need clearly defined understandings of how the judiciary is supposed to work, the distinction between judicial activism, making law, doing what the judges want rather than what the law says, but also the importance of judicial engagement, having judges step up and enforce constitutional limits when it's appropriate for them to do so. Um, if we're going to have people understand these principles, they have to be taught. And that requires people like us who have studied the Constitution, who hold it in high esteem, and who can persuasively teach people about these principles and how they should be applied. Um, so, what does that mean for you guys on a local level? I think it involves looking for teachable moments. I think it involves looking for particular parts of your community that have suffered the most from the absence of constitutional limits on governmental power, um, and then reaching out. Now, there is something else that I want to make sure that I add here. Uh, I think, and this is something that I believe quite strongly, that the people who may be most receptive to these constitutional ideas may not be the people that we would necessarily assume. I mean, there will certainly be, a hard kernel of the population that has long believed in and articulated constitutional principles, and they've advocated strict adherence to the Constitution. But if we only focus on them, we're just preaching to the choir. We're never going to grow the movement that will be necessary for the Constitution Party to become a serious force in American politics. We have to grow that audience. And that means getting away from the choir, going out and talking, spreading the gospel of the Constitution, without hopefully offending anybody by putting it that way, but spreading the word, helping people understand why constitutional values are so important. And this gets back a little bit to what I was doing at those churches in North St. Louis. Particularly minority communities have suffered from governmental abuses, and they don't always recognize that. I mean, they recognize that there's been mistreatment. They recognize that they have been disadvantaged in a number of different ways, but frequently it does not get attributed to the proper source. The great problem for a lot of these communities, not just minority communities, poor communities, is that the two parties have rigged the government against them. The two parties have denied opportunity. Instead of allowing fair treatment and equality of opportunity, you have government subsidies for preferred industries. You have the government putting the thumb in favor of certain interests while disadvantaging other interests. That, of course, is antithetical to our constitutional system. And if we go out and we can teach people about that and we can show them, look, this is not how the Constitution is supposed to work. Here's how it is supposed to work, and that would be to your benefit. We'll make converts. We'll find people who start to understand and eventually come around to our way of thinking. But I don't want to give anyone false illusions. I mean, it is a long-term project. It's a long-term goal, but it is an absolutely necessary goal to help the Constitution Party become what it should be in terms of its impact on our society. So I strongly encourage people to start thinking in terms not only of, well, what office am I going to run for? Think in terms of what communities most need to hear the message that the Constitution Party has to bring. How can we effectively communicate that message to them? How can we persuade them that adherence to constitutional principles rather than, focus on, oh, what new government programs can we institute, will result in the most benefits for their communities. So that is the gist of what I wanted to say. I wanted to say, number one, that we desperately need leadership. I think that in particular, we need leaders who focus on constitutional principles, leaders who talk about how adherence to those principles will take us as a society to a much better place, a more freer, a more prosperous society. And right now, the major parties simply are not equipped to provide that message and to provide that leadership. So I'm hopeful that all of you who are listening to this, that you'll look into how you can provide that leadership and to start on a base level, start locally, looking for ways to evangelize for liberty, get your name out there, build the credibility necessary so that people will start considering to actually voting and supporting the candidates that the Constitution Party is putting forward. If need be, focus on nonpartisan races so that there's not that label barrier that unfortunately is a very real challenge for third-party candidates when it comes to winning these sorts of elections. So if you can focus on a couple of nonpartisan elections, that can then lay the foundation for runs for higher office and potentially create a pathway for success so that eventually you could start seeing Constitution Party members sitting on city councils, sitting in state legislatures, and then ultimately possibly even having a seat in Congress or holding a statewide office. It's a long-term project, but it's a project that I believe not only is possible, it's one that I believe that you can accomplish. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I hope it's been useful. But for now, this is Dave Rowland with the Freedom Center of Missouri. Thank you for listening.